The day after my wife, Victoria, jumped into the river, her family held a funeral for her. Upon hearing the news, I dressed in a high-end suit with a red tie and attended the event. As soon as I stepped into the venue, Victoria's parents started yelling at me, "Sebastian, you murderer! How dare you show your face here? If it weren't for your constant abuse, our Victoria wouldn't have jumped into the river." Unexpectedly, I smiled, slowly took out a speaker from my bag and played DJ Boom Shakalaka. I danced and shouted, "Everyone, follow my rhythm and let's get hyped. I'm here for my wife's funeral." Victoria's mother, however, cursed at me. "You scoundrel, how dare you come here? Give me back my daughter." A middle-aged woman in mourning clothes grabbed me and pulled me violently. It took a lot of effort to pry her hands off my new suit. I threatened, "I advise you not to touch me. This suit is very expensive. If you accidentally tear it, you won't be able to pay for it even if you sell your house." The middle-aged woman's eyes were swollen from crying, and her voice was hoarse. She kept muttering, "You beast, I shouldn't have let my daughter marry you. Otherwise she wouldn't have died." Her eyes were filled with intense hatred. Indeed, Victoria had secretly married me at the Civil Affairs Bureau despite her parents' objections. But so what? I didn't force her to marry me. I laughed and said, "Aunt Margaret, you're being unreasonable. Marriage is a mutual decision. How can you blame only me?" At this moment, Victoria's father, Harold, arrived and angrily shouted, "You murderer! What are you doing here? Who allowed you to come? You're not welcome here. Get out." But I ignored him and leisurely ate the offerings on the table. While eating, I said, "Don't you know how to buy fruit? Your daughter didn't like apples, didn't you know?" Perhaps my behavior was too outrageous. The relatives who came to mourn started pointing at me and whispering, "Did you hear? This man abused his wife, and that's why she jumped into the river." I saw the body myself. The girl was covered in bruises. It was tragic. The worst part is that Victoria was almost 3 months pregnant when she died. Isn't that infuriating? The more they talked, the more excited I became. I jumped to the DJ's beat. Suddenly, someone in the crowd shouted, "Hit him!" Victoria's relatives began to surround me, ready to attack. But the next second, someone shouted, "Stop, police!" At the critical moment, a large group of police officers rushed into the funeral venue. Leading them was Detective Charles. I greeted him warmly. "Detective Charles, I'm here. I was the one who called the police." Detective Charles frowned and glanced at me. He said, "Mr. Sebastian, I advise you not to cause trouble at the funeral. Otherwise, even the police can't protect you." I pretended to be aggrieved and pointed at the people who wanted to hit me. I said, "How am I causing trouble? They were the ones who wanted to hit me." The next second, I quickly hid behind Detective Charles. I continued, "I'm just here for my wife's funeral, but they want to kick me out." As soon as I finished speaking, Harold stood up from the crowd and cursed at me. "My daughter was driven to death by you and you dare to mention her. Get out." At this moment, Victoria's colleague Ethan stood beside Harold and accused, "Officer, this man abused his wife for a long time, forcing her to jump into the river. Arrest him." Detective Charles slowly took off his hat, looked at Victoria's portrait, and said regretfully, "We have officially launched an investigation into the domestic violence case last night. We are still collecting evidence." Suddenly, Detective Charles paused, then turned to look at me and said, "We also summoned Mr. Sebastian last night, but—" I interrupted, "But today is my wife's funeral." I specifically applied to the police to attend. I stepped out from behind Detective Charles, grinning happily. As soon as I finished speaking, Harold exploded. He shouted, "You beast, how dare you call Victoria your wife? I don't allow you to call her that." He became more and more agitated, spitting on my face. Seeing this, I quickly hid behind Detective Charles again. I said, "It's not my fault she jumped into the river. Why can't I come?" Seeing the situation getting out of control, Detective Charles called a few officers to escort me out. I thought, no way. The funeral hasn't even started yet. As the deceased's husband, how can I leave early? The most important thing is that if I leave now, this outfit will be wasted. Especially this high-end suit which I had custom-made a week in advance. I said righteously, "Detective Charles, the funeral hasn't started yet. I can't leave." Seeing Detective Charles hesitate, I quickly flattered him. "With you here to protect me, there will be no problem." At this moment, the master of ceremonies hosting the funeral shouted from the hall behind, "It's time. Family members, please take your positions." The Liu family, being superstitious, temporarily left me aside to avoid missing the auspicious time. I silently followed Detective Charles into the hall. Soon the master of ceremonies professionally began hosting the funeral. He said, "Before the ceremony begins, the family members of the deceased, please take your positions on my left." Family members, isn't he calling me? So I straightened my tie and walked forward. But after a few steps, Harold glared at me and shouted, "Get out! You don't deserve to stand here." I wasn't angry and stood beside him. I leisurely said, "Uncle Harold, do you really want to argue with me in front of all these people? Don't blame me if we missed the auspicious time." Harold clenched his fists, but fortunately, he didn't continue to drive me away. Victoria was an only child, and I stood next to her parents. During the family gratitude session, everyone who came forward to look at me had expressions full of malice. However, my greatest virtue is my magnanimity. I responded to everyone with a smile and even made a heart gesture to some. The master of ceremonies said, "Victoria, born on August 7, 1999, passed away on January 3, 2024, at the age of 25. Her life was both brilliant and regrettable. She was filial to her parents, united with her colleagues, and loyal to her family." Suddenly, a burst of laughter broke the silence of the venue. Everyone looked at me. I quickly covered my mouth, trying to suppress my laughter. I apologized. "Sorry, everyone. I just thought of something funny and couldn't hold back. Please continue, host." I stood back in place, but the funeral couldn't just continue, especially for the superstitious Liu family. Sure enough, Harold stood in front of me, full of anger. He shouted, "Sebastian, if you don't explain yourself today, you won't leave this venue alive." I looked at him innocently and said, "Uncle Harold, I don't know what you want me to explain." He gritted his teeth and said, "I think you're deliberately causing trouble. Are you happy that my daughter is dead?" Victoria's mother also stood up and pointed at me, cursing, "Do you have any humanity left? You killed my daughter and now you're causing trouble at her funeral." I took a sip of water and patiently explained, "Aunt Margaret, you're overthinking it. I just thought of something funny and couldn't help but laugh." As soon as I finished speaking, I became the target of everyone's anger. The funeral turned into a chaotic market. Seeing that my goal was achieved, I slowly took out my phone and said, "Hello, Dr. James, are you here?" "Mr. Sebastian, I'm at the entrance of the venue. I'll be in shortly." In less than a minute, several doctors in white coats found me in the crowd. They said, "Mr. Sebastian, thank you for your contribution to medical science. On behalf of all the doctors at our hospital, I thank you." I adjusted my hairstyle and shook Dr. James's hands. I said, "You're welcome. She's already dead, so there's no use keeping her." Harold and Margaret were stunned by this sudden change. After a few seconds, Harold reacted and asked, "Who are you, and what are you doing at my daughter's funeral?" Dr. James was about to speak when I suddenly slapped my forehead and said, "Oh, I forgot to inform you. I asked Dr. James to take Victoria's body. Some of her organs are still usable." As I explained, I took out the prepared organ donation documents. I said, "Uncle Harold, Aunt Margaret, due to the urgency, I forgot to tell you. I hope you won't blame me." They both shouted in unison, "What? Who gave you the right to take my daughter's body? And you as a doctor? Don't you know that selling organs is a serious crime?" Their eyes stared at Dr. James as if they wanted to eat him alive. Seeing this, I quickly pulled him behind me and said, "I asked him to come. I'm Victoria's husband. After her death, I have the right to handle her body." Unexpectedly, as soon as I finished speaking, Harold threw himself onto Victoria's coffin. He shouted, "Let's see who dares to touch my daughter today. I'm her father. No one can touch her without my permission." This scene must have moved the relatives and friends present. It truly showed a father's deep love for his daughter. Dr. James was also confused and turned to ask me, "Mr. Sebastian, didn't you say your wife was an orphan on the phone? Who are these two?" I patted Dr. James on the shoulder, signaling him to wait. Then I picked up the microphone and said, "Dear friends and relatives of Victoria, good afternoon. I am Victoria's husband, Sebastian." Once I had everyone's attention, I continued, "Today is a joyous, no, a sad day. My wife, Victoria, has left me forever." But I dragged out the word and continued, "As her husband, I had a bold idea last night. I decided to donate my wife's organs to the hospital for research. This is also to let Victoria continue to shine in this world." After a moment of silence, the crowd erupted. Everyone present was a close friend or relative of Victoria. They all looked at me as if I were their enemy, especially Harold and Margaret, who were not far from me. They cursed, "Beast, you're a beast. Is there no law in this world? Is your heart made of stone? Your wife just committed suicide yesterday, and today you want to donate her organs. Isn't that pure perversion? Officers, what are you waiting for? Can't the law restrain him?" I was instantly drowned in a sea of curses. No one wanted to listen to me anymore. Some emotional young people even started throwing bottles at me. Fortunately, I reacted quickly and barely dodged. Helpless, I prepared to use Detective Charles as a shield again. I ran and shouted, "Detective Charles, save me!" But to my surprise, even Detective Charles didn't want to help me. The look in his eyes sent chills down my spine. He said, "Sebastian, I swear I will find evidence of your abuse and put you in jail." Seeing no one willing to help me, I had to dodge around. In the end, I stood on Victoria's coffin to escape. I shouted, "Don't move or I'll throw her out." Everyone turned pale with fear. Even Harold, who had been the most aggressive, started to calmly persuade me. He said, "Sebastian, come down. I promise we won't hurt you." I scanned the crowd, my eyes finally resting on a familiar figure. I yelled, "Who threw the beer bottle? Stand up." Soon Victoria's colleague Ethan stepped forward and said, "It was me. So what?" I squinted and sneered, "I heard you're my wife's colleague, Ethan, right?" Ethan, not backing down, replied, "Yes, it's me. Sebastian, I've disliked you for a long time." I wasn't angry, just continued questioning him. "I also heard from the police that you reported my wife's suicide. Last night, I had just returned from a business trip and was taken by the police as soon as I got off the plane. They told me it was because her colleague reported domestic violence. Is that right? You think you can report me for killing my wife?" Ethan, standing in the crowd, still spoke loudly. "Yes, I reported it. So what?" I looked down at him and said, "It's fine, as long as you admit it." Suddenly, I changed my tone. "Tell me, when did you start having an affair with my wife?" Ethan was stunned and said, "Sebastian, I warn you, don't talk nonsense, especially at Victoria's funeral." I sneered, "I bet the unborn child in my wife's belly was yours, right?" Harold couldn't sit still and said, "Sebastian, stop slandering my daughter. I won't allow you to tarnish her name after her death." I laughed at his words. "Tarnish her name? You two are still putting on a show for me?" I jumped off Victoria's coffin and stared at Harold. "Can you swear you didn't know about your daughter's affair?" Harold, frightened by my demeanor, stammered, "I don't know anything. I only know my daughter was killed by you. You're a murderer. Victoria's death is because of you. Everyone saw it. You abused your wife to death." Ethan and Harold stood together, united against me. Ethan said, "When your business failed, it was Uncle Harold who took you in. He treated you like his own son and even married his daughter to you. But how did you repay them? You abused your wife every day. If she hadn't been driven to suicide by you, we would still be in the dark. Sebastian, you're a beast in human clothing. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison." Ethan's words incited the crowd against me. I calmly took out my phone and said, "Ethan, explain this photo." The next second, a photo of Ethan and my wife in bed appeared on the big screen behind me. They were intimately embracing, looking like a couple. Ethan, seeing the photo, was furious. "It's fake." "Don't believe him. He must have photoshopped it." I expected his denial and smiled. The screen then switched to a video. In the video, two naked people were having sex. Afterward, the woman lay in the man's arms, her eyes dreamy. The man lit a cigarette and said, "Darling, when can we be together openly? I can't wait any longer." The woman replied, "Baby, let's wait a bit longer. Once we get his shares, you can divorce him." The video showed my wife, Victoria, and Ethan. After the 20-minute video ended, Ethan became the center of attention. He stammered, "When did you record this?" I recalled, "I knew from your first date. A year ago I saw an unread message on Victoria's phone while she was showering. It said, 'Baby, are you home?' From that moment I suspected she was cheating. To confirm my suspicions, I hired a private detective to follow her 24/7. It turned out she was not only sleeping with someone else, but also planning with Ethan and her father to take over my company. I wondered why large sums of money were disappearing from my company. They were being transferred to Victoria's overseas account. I endured all this to expose her ugly face in front of her friends and family. To my surprise, Harold still defended Ethan. "Even if my daughter was with someone else, you can't abuse her. It's still a life. You can't escape responsibility for her death." Harold continued, "My daughter can love whoever she wants. You shouldn't have abused her. She died because of you. Don't think you can escape the law." I watched their clownish performance, completely unfazed. I said, "Harold, stop pretending. Do you really think you're Victoria's father?" I looked at him coldly and continued, "You have no blood relationship with Victoria. She was bought by you. You've deceived everyone, including Victoria." Facing Victoria's body, I sneered, "She probably thought you were her father until she died, right?" My words landed like bombshells, one after another. Initially, I was curious why Victoria dared to sleep with other men in my villa. Later, I discovered through investigation that Harold had already conspired with them. Sometimes I even admired his acting skills. At least everyone present, including Detective Charles, was fooled by him. If I hadn't known the truth in advance, I might have been moved by this display of fatherly love. Exposed by me on the spot, Harold shamelessly said, "Everything you say is just your imagination. Do you have any evidence? Even the police need evidence to solve a case. What proof do you have to back up your claims?" I replied, "Simple." I raised my arm slowly, pointing to the body in the coffin. "A simple paternity test will tell if the child in her belly is Ethan's and prove you are not related by blood." I glanced at Dr. James, who was still in a daze, and took the microphone, shouting, "Dr. James, can we do a paternity test on the deceased?" Dr. James paused for a moment and then slowly nodded. I said, "Then I'll leave it to you." Suddenly, two voices shouted simultaneously, "No, no!" Harold and Ethan exclaimed. In the next second, Harold pulled out a lighter from his pocket and threw it forcefully. The flame landed on the wreath in front of him, and the fire spread quickly. In no time, Victoria's entire coffin was engulfed in flames. Detective Charles shouted, "Harold, are you crazy?" He began evacuating the crowd. Harold laughed. "Sebastian, didn't expect this, did you? Now you have no evidence. What will you do?" Ethan, who was also excited, said, "There's something else you don't know. Your wife has already given me the password to her overseas account. There's enough money in there to keep me happy for the rest of my life." I looked at them coldly and said, "Who said Victoria is dead?" Harold laughed maniacally. "Sebastian, stop deceiving yourself. With such a big fire, her body must have turned to ashes by now." I smiled faintly, clapped my hands and said, "Come out." At that moment, amidst the fleeing crowd, a figure walked towards us and said, "You two are truly heartless." The familiar voice reached Harold and Ethan, who were petrified. Harold stammered, Victoria, how did you escape? You were supposed to be in the coffin." He trembled, sweating profusely. Victoria said, "Are you disappointed that I'm not burned to death?" She walked past me in her hospital gown, whispered in my ear, "You won," and I smiled. I then shouted, "Extinguish the fire." Within minutes, dozens of people in black emerged, each holding a fire extinguisher. In less than 10 minutes, the fire was under control. As the smoke cleared, Harold's furious face emerged. He cursed, "You betrayed me." Victoria laughed. Harold, at this point you still have the face to say I betrayed you. If I hadn't been rescued from the coffin in advance, I'd be dead by now. The crowd outside the hall, seeing Victoria alive, looked horrified. They whispered, "Didn't she commit suicide by jumping into the river? How is she suddenly alive? Did her corpse explode? Look at her arms and legs. The previous injuries are gone. Have we all been deceived? Was she never dead?" Actually, I knew their final plan from the beginning. After transferring all the funds, they would use an accidental death to distract the police and then escape abroad. What they didn't expect was that I had seen through their plan from the start. I played along because Victoria and I made a bet. I bet Harold and Ethan would really kill Victoria, destroy the evidence, and run away with the money. Fortunately, I won the bet. As the loser, Victoria would turn herself in and expose Harold and Ethan's crimes as the sole witness. If I lost, I would give her the company and retire to the countryside. But I knew I wouldn't lose. Human nature is greedy, and this was especially true for Harold and Ethan. Harold asked, "When did you rescue her?" He looked deflated, pale. I replied, "You were too hasty." He looked confused. "What?" I said, "You were afraid my presence would disrupt your plan, especially seeing the police with me. But you overlooked Dr. James." I chuckled and glanced at Dr. James in the crowd. There was no organ donation. I just made an excuse for Dr. James to approach the coffin and rescue Victoria amidst the chaos. Harold sighed deeply and said, "I once treated you like my own son, Sebastian. What a pity." Harold laughed. "Nothing to pity." Just when everyone thought Harold would be arrested, he suddenly pulled out a dagger and swiftly took Victoria hostage. He gritted his teeth. "Back off. Everyone, back off." Even Ethan didn't expect Harold to take a hostage with a knife. Getting caught for this could mean the death penalty. "I can't care about that now," Harold said. "I'm destined for prison anyway. Might as well take a chance." I was stunned by the sudden turn of events. Detective Charles quickly reacted, evacuating the crowd, leaving just Harold and his group in the hall. Victoria, held at knife point, trembled and said, "Harold, are you crazy? I'm your daughter." Harold replied, "Daughter, my foot. I bought you. If it weren't for you, I'd be running off with the money by now. Say another word, and I'll stab you." Detective Charles slowly stepped forward, hands raised. "Mr. Harold, calm down. Let's talk this out. Put the knife down and we can discuss this." But Harold only pressed the knife closer to Victoria's neck, drawing blood. "Back off, all of you." Harold had lost his mind. "Step closer and I'll kill her. I'll die with her if I have to." Seeing no other choice, Detective Charles complied, stepping back slowly. Okay, just don't hurt her. We'll do whatever you want." Harold demanded, "Get me $1 million in cash and a car. You have 10 minutes or she dies." Blood soaked Victoria's clothes and it wouldn't be long before she bled out. I raised a bank card. "This card has $1 million. Let her go." I threw the card, which landed at Harold's feet. Victoria, weak, glanced at me with guilt. Harold's eyes were bloodshot as he laughed. "Sebastian, still a romantic, huh? Want to know what your wife said to Ethan in bed? She said she never loved you." She said, "Enough." I clenched my fists, suppressing my anger. "The money's yours. Just let her go." As Harold bent to pick up the card, Victoria suddenly pushed him. Detective Charles seized the moment, drawing his gun. A shot rang out and Harold fell. "Save her!" Medics rushed in, lifting Victoria onto a stretcher. As she passed me, she mouthed, "I'm sorry." I turned away, pretending not to see. Harold, shot in the arm, lay groaning on the ground. I picked up the card and said, "You reap what you sow." Ethan was taken away in a police car, ending the chaos. As I left the hall, rain began to fall. I adjusted my clothes and walked out. The next day, I received a call from the hospital. The doctor said Victoria wanted to see me. I refused without thinking. My decision to save her wasn't because of lingering feelings, as Harold suggested. It was out of respect for life. Years ago, when my business failed and I was at my lowest, Harold and Victoria took me in. This created feelings for Victoria, even though I later discovered it was all a lie. Deep down, I was still grateful. Without them, I wouldn't be where I am today. If my money could save a life, I was willing to give $1 million. On the day Harold was imprisoned, I applied for a visit. In the visiting room, Harold, unkempt and hollow-eyed, regained some emotion when he saw me. "Are you here to laugh at me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head no. I lit a cigarette and gestured for the guard to give him one too. "You didn't need to go to such lengths to cheat me out of my money." "I plan to leave the company to you and Victoria," I said. Harold looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" I took a deep drag and exhaled a smoke ring. "I have kidney failure. The doctor said I have less than 3 months. My will is in the bedside drawer. But," I coughed violently, "your greed ruined everything." Harold collapsed, crying. Whether his tears were for himself or not, it didn't matter. My time was running out. I came to tell him this to ease my own regrets. For my remaining days, I just wanted to see the world. I resigned as chairman and began my long-awaited global tour. A month later, hotel staff rushed me to the hospital. The doctor said his condition has worsened. Dialysis is no longer effective. Lying on the hospital bed, I smiled weakly. "It's okay. I don't blame you. I just wish I had more time to see more places." With that, I closed my eyes. In a hazy state, I heard a voice. "Mr. Sebastian, how do you feel? Any discomfort?" "Dr. James, Mr. Sebastian is awake." Opening my eyes again, I found myself on an operating table, in a familiar yet strange environment. I said, "Water." I tried to reach out but realized I couldn't move. The person next to me said, "Mr. Sebastian, you just had surgery. You can't drink water yet. I'll use a cotton swab to moisten your lips." I asked, "Surgery? What surgery?" I clearly remember the hospital issuing 3 critical condition notices before I lost consciousness. "You're lucky. They found a matching kidney just in time," the person replied. At that moment, Dr. James walked in and asked, "How are you feeling? No discomfort, right?" I tried to move my body. Aside from some pain at the incision site, I felt okay. I asked, "Dr. James, do you know who saved me?" Dr. James seemed hesitant, but the nurse excitedly answered, "It was Miss Victoria." Dr. James glared at her, then looked at me apologetically and nodded. "Yes, it was her." My heart skipped a beat. "Victoria?" I asked. He nodded. "Yes, it was her." Dr. James took out an envelope from his pocket and placed it on my bed. "She said to give this to you if you woke up." The envelope had only 3 words on it, "Sebastian." I nodded, signaling Dr. James to open it. Inside it read, "Sebastian, you don't need to thank me. By the time you read this, I will be on my way to prison. Dr. James told me you had kidney failure, and my kidney was a match. So, I donated my kidney to you before going to prison. This may be the only thing I can do for you in this life. I was trafficked as a child and wandered until I met you. If it weren't for you standing up for me that day, I might not be here now. You are a good person, and good people shouldn't die young. So live well and see the world for me." Signed, Victoria. Dr. James asked, "Do you want to see her now? There's still time." I silently put away the envelope and looked out the window. No, she probably wouldn't want me to.